Michael Cruse of Ultramarine Wines and Cruse Wine out of Petaluma, California, Northern California. It's such an honor to have you here today, Michael, on the Mr. Wine Guy podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Dude, I got to be completely upfront here with you and tell you, it wasn't until recently that I learned about you, and I was watching a reel on Instagram, and I'll talk a little bit about that more here in a second. But when I learned about you, I was instantly intrigued by who you are, what you've done. You have done something special in the wine industry with sparkling wines, with Pét-Nats, with some different varieties that aren't as common in your playground in Napa Valley and Sonoma and Mendocino and all these places. And you have taken these wines and you have transformed them to a level, to a higher tier when you think about Ultramarine and especially Cruse and just the excitement behind that brand and how you're paralleled so well with these two brands. Michael, it's an honor to have you here today. And I always get bummed out when I learn about somebody where it's like, where was I at? Like, why didn't I know about this dude? But you're such an inspiration to me right out of the gate, right out of jump. And I just want you to know, man, it's an honor to have you here today to get to share your story and talk a lot about what you do in California.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I always think it's funny. You end up being people say nice things like that, of course, and I really do appreciate it. But it is the fame that there's some slight amount of celebrityness in what is essentially a blue collar job is a funny gig.
It's funny. I just interviewed Russell Bevan in person. He's actually, so I'm in South Florida and he came to the restaurant. And when I met up with him, I hadn't met him before until that day. And I introduced him to one of the GMs at another restaurant. And it was like this star moment. And then we walked through the back of the kitchen and there's a guy that works in the kitchen that knows a lot about wine. And he stood there and froze. And you're right. There is this kind of celebrity-esque, and you are just like that, dude. You're just like Russell, man. You're crushing it.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I think we can get into it, but I think at the end of the day, I got into winemaking basically because, it paid $18 an hour. And I think that all the sort of, I don't even want to say accolades, but all the sort of things that kind of occurred afterwards are an addendum to what is essentially I hope a story of hard work and good luck. And that's probably it.
Yeah. That's one of the things about all these people that I interview, including yourself, is it's almost these backs against the wall, good luck. A lot of people like yourself, they're quick to the front of the line. There's people like you who've become winemaker of the year in such a short amount of time, and other people that became winemaker of the year. And I'm fortunate to have a lot of winemakers of the year, if you will, on this podcast. And there's just something about wine, and I think it has a lot to do with passion. I think one of the things that's very inspiring about you is just that passion and that willingness to jump in and try new things, that encouragement that you give yourself, and that, I guess, that permission that you give other people to also do that in their own personal life too, to step into something. And you've changed the game, if you will, when it comes to bubbles and Pét-Nats and all that. And so it's not that your story it's obviously just as cool as other people, but it's very unique, and you're leading the charge in your own arena, if you will.
Sure. Yeah, I guess that's true. I think of it like sparkling wine is, let me put it this way. Domestic sparkling is the story I keep telling whether or not people want to hear about it. How about that? You know what I mean? And I think that's the thing that's always the funny part for me is I think it is an important part, I think, of the California wine scene and the history and everything else. But I will say it's part of it is telling a story and trying to speak about terroir and site. But part of it is also, no, for real, we're really good at this. And I think that's the fun / difficult part, not necessarily like somebody's jumping for it.
You know what I've noticed about sparkling wine? I'll say this too, before we jump in. Sparkling wine gets a bad rap. I feel like it gets that intro to the meal, which is good. Everybody's starting out with that, experiencing that and toasting that. But I think the difference between that experience and that approach is with your wines, it's very much about the entire experience. It's very much about the entire approach to your meal, to your community. Do you think that kind of sets you apart a little bit, that you're not just this first at the line and done or one and done? Like, you're very much about the whole encompassment of the experience?
Yeah, I would say, at least as it applies to dining, I don't know that I've articulated it in this way. So if this comes out clumsy, I apologize. But I think that, look, we're different from Champagne. We're different from other regions that grow grapes for sparkling. And I would say that what we do have in California is a lot of sunshine. And with that comes a lot of ripeness. And with that ripeness comes a lot of weight and body and everything else. meaning that I would say for the most part, our wines are going to be able to be drunk with anything. And through the course of the meal, that's always been the case with Cruse. I wouldn't say that's always the case with Ultramarine, but certainly there have been wines early on. Some of our rosés, I thought you could basically just take them and just roll with it. For the most part, I've always looked at things that way, that my wines are part of a meal rather than an accompaniment to
Yeah.
them.
No, I like that. And you know what? I never really thought about that question until I asked it, because that's the thing about the
Uh-huh.
podcast is certain things come up, but it just sparked my mind because I always feel like sparkling or champagne, it's always
Hmm.
this, let's start off with this and then we move on and forget about it. But when I think
Mm,
of you and I think of your wines being the same wines, not all your wines,
yeah.
especially with Cruse, but Ultramarine
Uh-huh.
and your Pét-Nats and the sparklings with Cruse, I
Uh-huh.
feel like it's more than just start with and finish and move on.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, yeah, I was just in Korea and for this, I was in Asia for a wine trip and sales and all that fun stuff. And we finished the trip in Korea. And at the end of that event, we had this big meal, but it was a Korean meal and it with all the banchan and everything else.
Mhm.
And the whole time I was thinking, I was like, this meal from stem to stern would work with my wines kind of all the way through. Now, would you say the same thing about a big prime rib dinner? I probably could make it work. I don't know that I would necessarily assume everybody would like that experience,
You did make it work.
but yeah, I think the thing is that, one of the cool parts about wine, and I'm not necessarily assuming everybody would agree with me on this, but is that it's broadly applicable across cultures, across types of cuisine, and there is something uh, pretty wild about something that we've been continually making, at least in Western civilization kind of tradition
Right.
for 6,000 plus years. That's pretty crazy. And it is also, as this is an aside, but it is one of those things where when somebody asks me like, what's new or what's the new thing, or thinking that there's a secret technique or something like that, it's like, that 6,000 year number that's for a commercial winery. Do you know, do
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like we have archaeological evidence for a commercial winery that is 6,000 years old. There's not that much new under the sun. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
No, I hear you, man. I'm excited to have you here today and talk about all these things. And I want to start
yeah.
back. You grew up in Northern California, so you're a native
Mhm.
to your region, and
Yep.
you're a science guy, dude. And I remember reading a little bit about when you were at University of California, Berkeley, and you were in a class with a lecture, and your instructor, Terry Leighton, was
Uh,
almost enlightening you, no pun intended, to this world of wine. And in fact, Terry was working with wine at Kalen Cellars as well.
yeah.
So they had a passion for wine and a love for wine. And it started to really develop in you, and you started to see the chemistry and the wine come together. And I feel like this was an opportunity where you felt like, man, this is something I could see myself doing. Talk a little bit about that experience and how it had a lot to do with who you are.
Yeah. So Terry Cal is a really amazing university, and I would recommend it to anyone, but he is not a tender, loving private school, lovely setting. Do you know what I mean? Like and not to say it's a school of hard knocks either, but nobody really gave a shit about you.
Yeah.
One of the things that was fun is that for science majors, which my degrees in biochemistry, they had these freshman seminars. And just to show you, hey, this is what certain professors do in different fields. And there would be seminars on their research or their side projects or their hobbies. And
Uh-huh.
basically, Terry Leighton came to one that I was in and talked about winemaking. And I will say that, like, growing up in the Bay Area, I'm a fifth generation San Franciscan. Wine was always around, but it was around in the same way that, like, I imagine someone from the Midwest would talk about beer. Do you know what I mean? It was
Yeah,
just
totally.
it existed. That doesn't mean that it was something that I went up to Napa because I had family there, but that was the extent of it. And Harry is an interesting cat. I don't want to speak for him. He's passed now, of course, but I don't want to speak for him. But I think he was one of those guys that I think happens sometimes in professors who he is so multidisciplinary. he's such a Renaissance man that he had to have 18 things going. Again, that was my impression of him. I never was super close with him. And I always thought the wine was really interesting to me. And he wasn't actually, I don't want to say that it lit something in me because it didn't really. It was more like, oh, look at this guy, because he was a yeast geneticist.
Yeah.
And actually, he was my 110L, which is like a bigger class. He was my 110L professor too later on when I was a senior. And it was more like, hey, look at this really smart, really dialed in geneticist who has this other side thing. So I was always interested in food and wine and non-science things. And so for me, Terry was more like, not so much saying, oh, you should be doing wine, but more like saying, hey, it's okay for you to be doing this main thing and have all these other side interests, which I think was the big takeaway for me with Terry. Now, after I got back into wine, or got into wine, I should say, I then had a few conversations with Terry after the fact and talked to him a little bit more about his wine. And William over at the Robert Parker worked with Terry, and him and I always, I don't want to say always bring him up, but he comes up in conversation a lot. And actually, Terry made a sparkling one back in the early 90s, I guess. I've had a few of the sort of undiscouraged bottles. They're a little past their prime at this stage, but again, it was just always interested in what one could do in wine.
Were you trying to figure it out too? Obviously, you were going to school for a biochemistry major, but were you just trying to figure it out and this kind of sat with you a different way?
I was 1,000% convinced that I was going to be a professor. I was going to do academic research. If you had asked me at 22, 23, 24, 25, whatever, that's 100% what I was going to do. And what sort of changed is I had a run-in, makes it sound bigger deal than it was, but I basically was working at UCSF, queuing up PhD applications for biochemistry and biophysics and stuff. And I had a sort of, I'll keep it simple. It was just an interaction I didn't like. I didn't play my cards particularly well. I didn't do a very good job of things. And that's 25 and full of piss and vinegar.
Yeah.
And I got real mad, and I was like, you know what? To hell with this. I'm going to do something with my hands. And that's what I liked about science anyway, to be honest. I like there's a part in The Man with Two Brains with Steve Martin where I really like about science is the gooey stuff. And that was kind of me. Like I like the tubes and the pumps and stuff.
Yeah.
And so anywho, that was it. I was like, I can make, again, this is the mind of a 25-year-old, or maybe I was 26, but I was like, I can make $18 an hour driving a forklift. Fuck it. I'm going to do that. You know? And I think that's really what sort of drove me. And so what I did is that Davis has a master's program that I applied to. And my girlfriend at the time, who would be the wife and mother of my children, we're divorced now, but love her bunches. She was like, you probably should like work in this industry. You know what I mean? You know nothing about it. And then I was like, oh, that's a good idea. So I took a job, actually, funny enough, working for Sutter Home. And sort of kept getting promoted and different opportunities and never ended up going to school for it and just kept progressing. And it was funny. You started out the conversation sort of being like guys who develop things quickly. And I think the funny part for me is that I was in the industry 8 years before I started Cruse. Now I did start Ultramarine sooner, but it was like, to say that Ultramarine was like a well thought out plan, that's definitely not the case. So yeah, anyway, the point being just that I felt like I had already done 1 million harvests by the time I started my own thing, which again, that was still 10 years. So my first harvest was 2006. So where does that put us at? 18 years?
18 years.
I
have a multi
harvests
that was born in 2006. I'm on that.
There we go.
Got that number done. She's super healthy.
Amazing.
I want to talk a little bit about when you were working these various harvests, even when you went to Maryvale. So you were at Maryvale and Carneros for quite some time, but when you started to work,
that was my longest role.
When you started to work in different houses, were you starting to appreciate all these hands-on techniques that you may have not considered prior to your passion for science?
I took, okay. So one thing that people very often talk about, oh, so did you just take the chemistry that you knew and apply it to the winemaking that would come? And I never thought of it that way because I do think of them as very special, very different things. And like
Right.
the way that I would put it in a way that like makes sense to people is imagine you're like an astrophysicist. And I'm not trying to, this is not braggadocious, but your work is like cosmology and formulas,
Mhm.
math, right?
Yeah.
And then somebody asks you to be a mechanic, right? Now, are there parts of those two things that are like comparable? Of course, there's
Mhm.
torque equations and things like that you can use for tuning an engine. That's all true. But what one person does and the other person does is totally different.
Mhm.
And so for me, though, and I'll get to answering your question, but what I did, or what I think I did, was I said, okay, now I'm not going to go to school for this. So now I need to learn everything there is to know about this. So every textbook, Davis's textbooks, Fresno textbooks, what you would get at Montpellier or Bordeaux,
Mhm.
those textbooks, I read all of them. And for about 5 or 6 years, I was reading every journal article on this stuff too, that I could get my hands on. And I really wanted to learn as much as possible. Now, when I started my own thing, that sort of slowed down because you have to run a business and manage
Yeah.
people and stuff. But when I was earning a paycheck, I was reading about winemaking easily 20% of like my non-harvest time.
Yeah.
Now it's maybe 10%, maybe, but it still was something that I did a lot of. And I did the whole WSET thing and I did all of that. And so I guess what I would say is that I took my actual job seriously, but my big, any spare time I had, I was trying to spend on learning stuff. And I think that's what really drove me. I'm not that way now just because kids and running a business and everything else, but I still try to go to France, spend a year or spend a few days in Champagne every year. I still try to do tastings. I still try to do all that other stuff because I just think it's part of the gig.
Yeah, I love the fact that you were excited and you were focused and you weren't just trying to learn as you went, but you were applying yourself in additional ways to learn. And I think that had a lot to do with
Mm.
the reason why you were able to spring forward so much in the wine industry. And I know when you were at Maryville, you became assistant winemaker, and there towards the end, you started to realize maybe I want to start my own project. And in '08, you start
Hmm.
Ultramarine, a few partners. You
Hmm.
open up a custom crush facility in Petaluma. So
Yeah.
talk to me about Ultramarine. What at the time were you like, we're going to open up a bubble house, we're going to do it this way? Were you focused on other things? And what's cool about Ultramarine is it's California's first cult sparkling wine. And a lot of people, I've noticed this, Michael, online, and people have said this multiple times, they haven't even tried Ultramarine. Like it's
Mm.
that cult. And so it's cool that you have this cult bubbles under your belt. When you think of cult wines, you think of these big Tokalon Reds and Dr. Cranes and all these different places that have these very cult-like followings for their reds. But this is what makes you different. This is what makes you an innovator. So talk a little bit about
Mm.
Ultramarine, how that started, and what your focus was going into that.
Yeah. So we started, it was me, Graham Waymeyer, who's now at Diamond Creek, and Ryan Bradley. And we're just some buddies. And we were sitting around my dining room table and we said we should do a project together. And back in '08, that was the rise of kind of the single vineyard Pinot Noir thing.
Hmm.
And in my head, I just had this idea. I was just like, I don't want us to do like a $45 bottle of Pinot Noir that everybody else is doing. I don't
Yeah.
want another, I don't know, another, for lack of I don't know, another Cerise Pinot from Cruse Wine or something. I
Yeah.
don't know. I didn't want that. And I was like, what can we do? And Graham did one harvest at J, and we had all liked sparkling wine. I said, let's do sparkling. And this part's always funny to me because I had an idea of what I wanted to do from not the word go, but I would say 2 years we practiced like just doing tirages. Like literally we would have Bloody Marys and tirage bottle on my back porch because I was convinced that was going to be the hard part. And then as I started learning more about winemaking, I think my first, time in Champagne was maybe, I'd been going to France since '04, I think was, or no, '02 was the first time.
Hmm.
And I started going to Champagne, I think I'm going to say 7 or 8, could have been 9, but in that range. And no, it was before Ruby was born. So 7 would have been the year. And I met a bunch of folks there, but one that was really influential to me was Marie Noelle Lejeune. And she is now, she's retired, and her wines are $500-600 a bottle and stuff. But at the time they weren't. And she was just this humble winemaker in Ambonay who made relatively ripe Pinot Noir and did everything by hand. And I think that once I saw that, not that I was trying to copy her style or anything like that, but I think once I saw that, I realized the idea of us making Krug didn't make sense.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the differences, there's a couple things that we can talk about, the differences between Ultramarine and other sparkling wine folks before us. But one of them is that site was the most important thing for us. You know what I mean? And as no offense, literally zero offense to Schramsberg, J. Schramm is about a bigger, riper, richer, longer tirage, large house tete de cuvée style wine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a moment where we thought, oh, that's what we should do too. We should do like this 7-year tirage. We should do lots of oak. We should make this really lean kind of thing. And I think I realized before the rest of the boys did that, no, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
What we should do is this thing. The other thing that I did that was, and you'll see why I said this in a second, is that once we did get popular, which wasn't instantaneous, it was close, but it wasn't like we had already been making Ultramarine for 6 years before anybody really got into it.
Yeah.
Once I realized that we can't experiment with Ultramarine. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And to put it a different way, like the goal of Ultramarine is now to make it perfect, insofar as anything that from a single vintage could be perfect, but to not really experiment or play around with. Cruse is where we can experiment and where we can play around with different techniques. But Ultramarine is this straight ahead, almost monastic, like study of sight in sparkling wine. And once I put that together, that's all I would say I ever did with Ultramarine. Ultramarine had a life of its own. We were in the right place in the right time. We started out with the 2010 vintage from Heinz, which was a really good vintage for sparkling wine. So everything came together, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it was something we did on purpose. The two things we did on purpose were realizing it and then protecting it. And I think that the big thing for me is looking forward, when we grow and when we add vineyards and when we experiment with things, just making sure that they're like as precise and perfect as what we've done in the past.
Michael, a couple things that came to my mind. One, when you think about how you were able to find the right pockets of area to pull fruit, really cold climate, lots of aromatics, lots of acidity. Your wine, they're blowing through the roof with acidity. How were you able to identify exactly? Was this when you were like studying on your time off? And also, I remember reading something about your first vintage with Ultramarine, and it really wasn't up to your par. It probably was really good, but in your mind, it could have been better. So talk about how you were able to, like, within one vintage, transform, and how Charlie Heinz was really the defining factor that kind of got you on track to where you wanted to be, and also answering the question about the sites.
Yeah. '08 and '09 were just practice vintages for us. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In '08, we basically just used some waste topping wine that was at 10% alcohol just to play around with.
Yeah.
In '09, I borrowed, honestly, it was a sort of a longtime friend of ours. And he loaned us basically a ton of fruit to play around with. And it was good fruit, old vine, Chardonnay in Carneros. And it was fine. It was fine, but it didn't really hit. It was fine. That's the way I would put it. It was fine. And I think that we were all not disappointed. I wouldn't say that, but we were like, all right, that was fun. I'm glad we did that, but
We could do better.
Or maybe we shouldn't be doing it. I think maybe that's what we were thinking. And that year when I was at Maryville, we had a couple of clients. They did a lot of custom crush, which is why I ended up doing my own custom crush here, which it's boring. It probably isn't at all interesting to your listeners to talk about that. But when you started out with Cruse being a custom crush facility, that's where it came from, because that's partially what I was doing at Maryville. Anywho, we had a client there who was known for, I won't mention their name, but they were known for big, riper styles of wine. Mm-hmm. And they were experimenting on Chardonnay. And they had purchased maybe 4 or 5 different lots of Chardonnay that year, most of it from the Sonoma coast. No, I shouldn't say that. That's not true. Most of it from Sonoma coast, but not like extreme, right? Not from the extreme Sonoma coast, I guess. More, anyway, doesn't matter. So because they were known for a riper style, they would try to get stuff up in like 25 bricks, 26 bricks range, really quite ripe for Chardonnay.
Yeah.
And they had this super botrytis, in their mind, disgusting Chardonnay come in. And this would have been the 09 vintage. And it was from Charlie's. And I tasted it. I didn't taste a lot of clients' wines, but this was a special client to me. I was good friends with them and I wanted to make sure that everything was good. So I'd taste a little bit their wine and make sure everything was copacetic. So I tasted this and something clicked in me. I was like, I like this. It wasn't picked how I would pick it. It wasn't harvested correctly. It was too late, yada, yada, but I really like it. And I'd found out that it wasn't going to work for them. They weren't going to pick up the contract again. So I reached out to this owner and said, hey, do you mind me reaching out to Charlie and just see if I can get that fruit? So I called Charlie and Charlie said, what are you doing? Who are you? And he said, come on out and we'll talk. So I came out and we talked and they had a lot of faith in me. And also I would say, to be honest, it was an expensive prospect for us. You know what I mean? We had no idea what we were doing. And this was like a real investment. And honestly, one that we would have to make for the next 4 or 5 years before we actually sold anything. But he did. He let me have, I think, 3 tons of Chardonnay, 3 tons of Pinot Noir. And that was in 2010. And it was a great vintage then. And I freaked out over the fruit. I think it was great. We did a Saunier Rosé for the Pinot Noir. I was still convinced that it wasn't good for what it's worth. But we had talked to Michel Saug, who unfortunately just passed away maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but he was the former chef de cave at Roederer, who had moved out to California to help out with Roederer in Anderson Valley and then sold Cacard presses. And he ended up working with Carcaccioli in Monterey County. Anyway, he came by, he tasted some stuff and we chatted with him for a little bit, picked his brain. He was very generous with his time. And he tasted the 2010. And he goes, so it was in French, but he basically told me very powerful, but lacking in elegance. Uh-huh. I can remember it like it was yesterday. And I was like, perfect. Do you know what I mean? I was like, literally excellent. That's what we're fucking going for. And I think that was probably the first time where I'm like, maybe this will actually work. So.
Yeah. When you think about Ultramarine, I think around 1,000 cases, you started to realize that you didn't want to compromise. You talked about that a lot. And I want to go back to what you talked about when you compare Ultramarine and Cruse, because I had this illustration and this idea that Ultramarine is very specific. It's very buttoned up. It's very tight. It's perfect, as you said. And then Cruse, it allows you to make more wine and to experiment with different varietals. And we'll talk about that right now and sparkling and some different red blends. And this is your playground. And so you didn't want to compromise with Ultramarine at 1,000. And so you start Cruse wine and talking about Pét-Nat. So I want you to explain Pét-Nat, but this is basically what the French called Pétillant Naturel, which is basically a French term for naturally sparkling. And the only difference in a Pét-Nat, to my knowledge, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and a traditional sparkling is with a Pét-Nat, you don't add the sugar, you don't add the yeast, and you just allow the sugar from the grapes to be the sugar for the Pét-Nat. So this is going to be lower alcohol. For you, it's like anywhere from 10 to 11%. I know you want a lot of carbonation in your wines. I know you want your sugars to be at a certain gram level. And so talk a little bit about Pét-Nat, and was the Pét-Nat process that you make your wine with Cruse, which is not all your wines, But was that kind of one of
Mhm.
the things that you wanted to do different and more of an inspiration for you when you started Cruise?
Yeah, I would say that Cruz started out with the idea of being in the natural wine scene. I think I now I would say we're more like natural wine adjacent. We still work with just kind of organic fruit with exception of the Saint Laurent, and we've never added anything to our wines. But I do think that technique wise, I don't think it tends to be just about being natural. So it's a little less of a focus for us.
Yeah.
But yeah, henna was really important more because I thought that we could do it better than people were doing it. I think that's one thing that we haven't talked about is that I've always liked doing hard things. I would admit to that. And maybe that's almost just a vanity thing more than anything. But I really like doing difficult things. And Pét-Nat is extremely difficult. We always want it to be dry. We always want it to be high pressure. We always riddle and disgorge it. But I would say, and you did a great job of explaining it. The simple way I explain it is, you know, the bubbles are carbon dioxide, right? And the carbon in traditional method comes from added sugar, and the
Mhm.
carbon in Pét-Nats come from grape sugars. And
Right.
there's no particular difference one way or the other. Pét-Nats tend to be a little bit more grapey and a little more primary. And traditional method, because it requires you to start with a dry base wine, tends to be more about sort of secondary characteristics. We've done traditional method like Valdegay, for example, and those wines are like extremely varietally correct. What do I mean by that? Like the varietal character is super, super strong in those. That rose, raspberry, bramble is like over the top. As we're on the
Yeah.
Pét-Nat of the exact same wine, you get more of the acid, you get more of the sort of walking through the vineyard smells and the kind of like grape flower and that type of thing, that kind of slight
Totally.
herbaceous note. Anyway, the first sparklings we did for Cruise were Pét-Nats, and I thought that was going to be a good delineation between the two. And then starting in, I guess, 2015, as I was playing around with adding more sparklers to theoretically ultramarine, I realized that not everything worked in the sort of ultramarine, not every wine worked well in the ultramarine program, I guess is
Yeah.
the right way to put it. And I started to get more involved with kind of more oxidative styles and pushing that a little bit. And that's when I became more interested in traditional method for Cruise. But again, more oxidative, not blocking mallow, shorter times in tirage, and kind of that being a separate playground. But yeah, it started with Pét-Nat. The funny thing is just that, like I said, I don't have different hats. I'm the same guy making all the wines. So the pressing, and which ends up being super important in sparkling wine, the pressing that we do for the Pét-Nats is essentially the same as what we do for
Traditional.
certainly Cruise and Ultramarine. And I think that tends to be one of the key elements of how we examine site in California with bubbles in it.
Yeah, and dude, I think one of the great things about you is you're very much about terroir. You're very much about site, and
Mhm.
these wines are speaking of a specific place, and that has been always been the goal for you, whether it's been ultramarine or cruise.
Yeah.
And going back to how I started this podcast, the way that I actually learned about you was Dustin Wilson, MS Dustin Wilson,
Uh-huh.
did a reel.
Yeah. Yeah.
By the way, this reel, I watch it sometimes. I'll watch it back to back because it's just so interesting. And you guys are all
Uh-huh.
tasting, you're going through the cruise. And when you were pouring your Pét-Nats, one of the things that I noticed was they were very foamy. It was like they were very
Yeah.
frothy. And I wonder
Yeah.
if that kind of what is coming off of a Pét-Nat, because you actually poured a cruise sparkling and it didn't come off that foamy. And when I hate to use these
No.
terms because as a somm, I'm always like thinking about correlations. And the Pét-Nat
Sure.
reminded me of this like aquafaba look. Like it was very
Hmm.
foamy, very frothy, very delicious
Yeah.
looking.
Yeah.
Is that kind of an like a visual illustration of how your Pét-Nats are going to come off as far as the way that I interpreted it?
Yeah. I think that's totally reasonable. I think that Pét-Nats, because I'll say this, what I'm going to say is not proven science. This is Michael's guess for why that is, right? Okay. Is
Yeah.
that when you have a sort of primary fermentation, there's a lot of gunk in there. There's a lot of grape skins and products and I don't know, whatever leftover burrito I had on my hand while I was like dumping it. Or, I don't know. And when you have that and that goes direct to bottle, you do have a higher protein load on the wine. And that sort
Interesting.
of is what you're seeing when you see that kind of big foaminess, right? When
Yeah.
you're talking about traditional method sparklers, you don't have that in the same way because the wine's been already been aged a year almost. For us, it's a year in barrel. And then that drops out a lot of that extra protein. So the only protein you have in terms of the bubbles is from the secondary fermentation. So it's quite a bit less. So you never have that same kind of like beer foam or
Oh,
the
yeah.
kind of thing.
So would you say that a pet nat is more of a pure representation, like for stronger varieties, and that not all varieties are meant for a pet nat fermentation?
I think that's true to some extent. I think for me, to put a very slightly finer point on it, I would say I like having stronger varieties in pet nats. That's not to say that Chardonnay can't make a good pet nat. I'm sure it could,
Yeah.
but I take the old sort of the inspiration from some of the guys from the Loire that we were doing in the first place. So Chenin or um, then these sort of very aromatic varieties work really well as pet nats because you're going to get a lot of that primary character in those wines in the first place.
So I didn't mention this earlier, or maybe I did, but one of the things that I'm learning as I grow in wine, I've been doing wine for about 18 years. I've been studying wine and
Mhm.
understanding wine and trying to grow and get better. Is I'm looking for opportunities to learn and of course better appreciate terroir, which you're all about that. You're all about place. You're all about getting your wines to speak of the place that they come from. And people are actually literally tasting it, whether it's a block or a vineyard. But as I start to learn more about brands like yourself, I start to really appreciate the story behind the wines. And your wine is one of those wines where if I'm putting it on the table at a party, it's going to be a conversation that never goes away. It's going to
Mhm.
be something that people are always going to talk about. And also too with Ultramarine, if you had those two side by side, they're so different, but they're so you. And I think that's what
Mhm.
makes it so interesting is you're
Mm.
able to pick apart at different areas to encompass yourself. But with Cruse, you also have some field red blends. I want to talk a little bit about them.
Mhm.
First of all, you have Monkey Jacket. So Monkey Jacket is your flagship
Yeah.
wine. This is from an old British sailor song, the name Monkey Jacket.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting because Monkey Jacket is actually a field red blend. It's not
Uh-huh.
bubbled, it's pet nat, but yet you call this, I guess, your flagship. I find that kind of
Yeah.
interesting. How come Monkey Jacket of all the wines is your flagship?
I suppose that's true. It's funny. Of course, I don't see the inconsistency, but that's not for me to. I think that what's funny is that Monkey Jacket comes out. The history of Cruise is this essentially that one of the first wines we did was Valdez from Rancho Chimilas.
Uh-huh.
And that wine was lovely and was inexpensive and fun. And it got popular relatively quickly, to be honest. And we sold out of it very quickly. And a couple of years later in New York, I was with a friend of mine and she was saying that wine was getting allocated. And this is at the time, it was $25 or something. And I like, I don't know, it crushed me a little bit because like here I am trying to make this blue collar kind of wine
Yeah.
for people. I really am sensitive to pricing. It drives me nuts when stuff's too expensive. And yeah. So anyway, so Monkey Jacket comes out of that. So Monkey Jacket did not start from the idea of being a red field blend. It started out with the idea of being a Valdez based blend
Hmm.
to showcase what I think of, and I still argue is probably like the premier grape of Northern California in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
And anyway, so for me to agree with you, but say it slightly differently, I think the reason why it's a flagship wine is because I think of it as very much California wine. And I think of myself as like very much a California winemaker.
Yeah.
Ergo, that is the wine that we make. We make the most of it too. We're in the 2000 case range for most vintages. The 21, which is released now, is less. It's about 1,000 cases, but that was a transition year. We're back up to 2,500 in 2022. And California has a lot of sunshine
Yeah.
and growing grapes should be easy here. And there you go. That's an average vine age is 70 years old. It's super drinkable. It's not super expensive. And that's really that was the most important wine to me to have out on the floor.
I want to talk about a few varieties that you have with Cruz.
Mm.
I'll start with Saint Laurent. Saint Laurent is a seedling, more or less, of the Pinot Noir family, but it's a very dark
Yeah.
skinned varietal. This is a sparkling that you have with Cruz.
Yeah.
So with it being such a dark skin varietal, how long are you leaving skin on with a variety like so dark?
It's very funny. I will tell you honestly that if you ask me to pick Saint Laurent from Pinot Noir out in the field, I don't think I could do it. It looks like a tight, dense clone of Pinot. And sometimes we make that wine as a rosé. Sometimes we make it as a Blanc de Noir. But for the most part, we let the vintage dictate that.
Hmm.
So we try not to macerate it for longer than, I don't know, somewhere between 6 hours is probably in the
Oh,
high
wow.
end. Six
Yeah.
to 12. We will let it go overnight, maybe, but even then it would be like just barely essentially.
Yeah.
And if we do it as a Blanc de Noir, we just put it straight to press and then it might have a very light orange hue then. But yeah, for us, the reason why we've always done that as a Pét-Nat is because not because of the color, but rather because it always has a very particular aroma. It has more like blueberry, raspberry syrup fruit to it, which is not something that you actually find in Pinot Noir, or not very easily. Certainly not at 10% alcohol. So,
I want to talk about your Rancho Valdegui. Was
mhm.
Valdegui kind of one of the inspirations for starting Cruise? I feel like I read that back in the day. Valdegui.
100%. Yeah. I think that for us, Valdez is a variety that comes to California in the after World War II, which is weird. Like we don't really have that. We have varieties that are like Carignan and Zin that are pre-prohibition varieties, along with various red field blends. And then Valdez comes in after World War II to help out farmers, as far as I
Right.
can make out. It grows in popularity, and in the early 70s when it was planted at Rancho, it was about 10% more expensive than Cabernet. Robert Mondavi was like, "Oh, this is what we're all to make in the future. This is going to put us on the map."
Mhm.
And then it falls out of favor when after Judgment Paris and Sauvignon Blanc becomes a bigger thing. But to me, it grows like a weed. It keeps its acid really well. You don't need to have a bunch of powdery mildew sprays because I would say impervious to it, but it's not particularly susceptible to it. It crops really well. It crops dry farms. It's just a really lovely variety to work with. So yeah, no complaints.
That Rancho Valdegui, the pH is like incredible on that wine. And this is what I think you call one of your best pet nats. Talk about why the
Mm.
pH is so special with that wine.
It's funny because that ends up being an experimental vineyard for us. So we make it as a still wine. We've made it as traditional method.
Mhm.
We make it as Pét-Nat. And like I said, it holds its acid really well. So if you just go direct to press with it, very often you're going to see a pH in the 3 to 3.2
Yeah.
range, regardless, even if it goes through mallow. Now, there's a lot of potassium in the skins for Valdez. So if you do keep it on skins and make it into a red wine, it's going to be more normal. It's going to be
Mhm.
more in the like 3.4 to 3.6 range, but it's still what I would call, at least in California, a pretty high acid grade, regardless of where it's planted. Eh,
Yeah.
it can be susceptible to increases in pH, but for the most part, it's pretty impervious.
Yeah, definitely a food wine, something that you want to pair
Mhm.
something with. I want to talk real quick about your labels on Cruise. So
Sure.
I'll tell you my interpretation of the labels. I think they're
Okay.
incredible. I love them. The first Batman, when the Joker walks
Uh-huh.
in to the art
Uh-huh.
gallery and he's got all the goons with him, and they
Yeah.
start
Yeah. Yeah.
vandalizing all the art.
Yeah.
When I was a
Yeah.
kid and I watched that, I thought, man, they ruined the art. And now as I'm an
Yeah.
adult,
Yeah. Yeah.
I look at that and I'm like, man, they're the artists. They're the ones that
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
they're the
Yeah.
ones that
Yeah.
made the art. Talk about your
Yeah.
bottles
Yeah.
though, because when I look at your bottles, I feel like you're like the Joker, this mad mathematician guy that's going in
Yeah.
there and not just creating wines that are incredible in the bottle, but also these labels really speak. So talk about that.
So I have a little husband design team. Their name's Force and Form, and they were buddies of mine. And they'd done some label work, but I don't think that was their main thing. I'm sure they could correct me if
Yeah,
I'm speaking out of line. But so when I was starting up Cruise, Ultramarine's a different label, actually. Ultramarine was
totally.
designed by CF Napa, and they took us as a charity case, to be honest. But with Force and Form, they had a couple ideas initially. And one of them was like almost this Tim Burton, like gothic. I loved it. But it was like it would never have sold a bottle.
Yeah.
Honestly, God, it was like, if you drink this, it's it actually, funny enough, it looked like the old arsenic and lace. Like
Yeah.
it was lovely, but it wouldn't sell wine. And the other design was this. It was the first one was the Rancho Valdegue, which is the cow label. And it was this idea that cow is where we got the vaccinia vaccine from. So vaccinia, it's a long story that we don't need to go into, but the smallpox vaccine is from a cow,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's actually vaccinia virus. And so as a sort of homage to my former biomedical science background, they had this cow on there. And then the spray paint and all that. And it was this idea of what we're using all these old traditional techniques. We're making very traditional classic wines, but with this sort of nod to the modernity and the new. And that really is the spray paint. So that's been the motif that's in all of our wines. And some of the labels mean stuff, some of them don't, but it's just always been a nice sort of continuation for everything.
Michael, one of the things that I could say this over and over again, and I don't want to bore you, but I'm so overwhelmed with you and just the what you have done by creating such a cult ultramarine sparkling. And then the things that you've done with Cruse, like I said, if I took a bottle of Cruse out, set it on the table, not only would it speak from within, it would pair well with the food. You could tell stories about how it looks in the glass, but you can talk about the
Mm,
label. You can talk, everybody would talk about you. It's just, that's what I love as I grow and as I gain knowledge and I get better and smarter and I start to develop a better understanding, throwing and casting my net, if you will, is I love having people like you where I'm able to find you and then instantly want to learn more about you and your wines and
mm,
all of that. And so I think your wines truly tell a story. And I know in 2016, you were San Francisco Chronicle Winemaker of the Year. When you got
yes.
that award, do you think a lot of that had to do with the fact that you were doing things so differently? Obviously, you were creating incredible wines, but you were able to identify sites, tell very specific stories from terroir, which, like I've said over and over, is very important to you. And you were able
Mm.
to create this storyline behind your wines. Everything that I've just mentioned, was that the emphasis, of course, other than the fact that you were making incredible wines, of how you were doing it and you were being so different about it and so great?
I think Esther Mobley wrote that article, and Esther, who just had her first child and is on maternity leave right now, I think I wonder what she would say about it. But I took it as sort of a recognition of probably more of what I was doing with Valdegay than with Sparkling, if I'm being honest. And I think it
Okay.
was more of a recognition of sort of my California focus than anything. But I'm very grateful, honestly. And I think it was probably undeserved, but I think that I think a lot about how I want to say this without sounding super vain, but I think a lot now about how basically how do we take the techniques of the old world and use them here, and specifically meaning champagne and getting people interested in making and consuming the bounty of California if we can be so bold about it. So that's been the big thing for me with that was really it was a kick in the ass for me, to be honest. It was more of a all right, now somebody said that you're good. Now let's make sure that you actually are. And it's funny because I would say that was in 2016. I would say completely unrelated, but that was the first year where I felt like I almost know what I'm doing in Spark One.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it had taken me that long to feel like I had a sense of whether I was on foot or horseback. And I think that like that, though those two things were not connected, obviously. Anytime somebody brings it up, I remind myself of that in my head. Okay, remember that you didn't know what you were doing then either. So
Yeah.
it's really important to not just stay humble, but keep working to make sure that you can actually be taken seriously. For lack of a better way to put it.
Dude, when I look at what you're doing and the things that you have done, I'm very much reminded of this think outside the box, but go for what
Mhm.
you love. Go for something that you're passionate about. Don't try to be necessarily like others. Like you were referring to how much love to Schramsberg and they have such a history, some of the most history, if you will, as far as a bubble house in California.
Sure.
But with all that history, you were like, no, I want to do it this way. We want to do it different. And then as you started to do that, you started to navigate into what I like to call your playground with Cruse. You were
Mhm.
doing all
Mhm.
these different things with all these different types of ways that you make your wines. And I think it's just a testament to you, dude. I think it's a testament to what you've done, who you are. And I think that the road has literally just begun. You're a young guy, obviously, and you've got so many more opportunities to get Winemaker of the Year and to create new experiences and new wines. And Michael, how can people find you? How can they learn more about you through social media, websites, mailing lists, purchase wine,
Yeah.
especially?
Yeah. Ultramarine, unfortunately, you can sign up for the list. It's ultramarinewines.com. It's about a 3-year waiting list right
Yeah.
now. But I'll also say something about that. We sell Ultramarine for $80, $85 is I think what we sell it from the website when you're at the end of that 3-year list. Maybe it'll be 100 by the time you get to it, but who knows, in that range. If you want Ultramarine now, there's dudes on WineBid.
Oh, that's exactly what I was just gonna say.
You can get it. Like it's fine.
200
you know?
bucks, 215, 220.
$200. Yep. That's not my price. You're helping somebody pay for their kid to go to college, but that not me, more power to them. But if you really want it, it's there. And then of course, great restaurants around the country and the world. For Cruse, cruisewineco.com, we got all sorts of stuff up there now. Got a funny little holiday Magnum shipper that's fun.
I saw that.
And,
Make an investment, dude. That's pretty cool.
yeah, you're more than welcome to it. It's the reserve cask is pretty amazing. I think we're down to the last few hundred cases of that at the few hundred. We didn't make 100 cases, but we last 10, 20 cases of the winery. But yeah, follow me on Instagram. It's Cruse Wine, Cruse wine. And yeah, that's it.
All of that will be linked in the show notes. So everybody that's listening, they'll be able
Great.
to click the links and sign up. And it's funny you mentioned WineBid because I thought about it when you started to talk. And then I said, nah, I'm not going to say that because I don't want to plug on WineBid because I feel like sometimes that takes away. But bro, I was actually looking at that last night just at random.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, you can get this vintage for this in 220, 215, 230. So it's funny that you mentioned that.
I'd say it only because not that I give 3 shits about WineBid. I don't. It's just more that a lot of times people do reach out to me and like, where can I get it? You can get it there. Actually, it's funny enough. Flatiron has a little bit right now. The San Francisco Flatiron has a few 4 or 5 bottles. So you're more than welcome to hop on there and go bananas if you want to try it. And I think the thing with Ultramarine, not to leave it on this because it's a weird way to end it, but that wine is taking on a life of its own. And I honestly, when it leaves the cellar, sometimes I'm just kind of like, it's gone to another place and I don't really have any control over it. But the 16, 17 and 18 were really good vintages. And there's a lot of that stuff out there now.
Nice.
You're out.
Michael, I always like to end the podcast with a final question. And with me, I feel like you opened this third eye to me, being able to really learn about and experience and appreciate wines in a different way than I'm used to, especially with Cruse. And of course, you talk about Ultramarine, but Cruse has really been such a standout to me. Would you agree that when people learn about you, that they're also feeling that kind of way as well? And then on the back of that answer, is there something else? And if there is, and you don't want to say it, that's fine. I get it. But is there something else that you have in your back pocket that you're going to work on, or that maybe you're working on now that you're excited to do in the future?
Yeah, I would say this. I would say that like, I've always said that my wines have to pass the mom test. And what I mean by that is that my mom doesn't really know shit about wine, but I want her to be able to taste them and to recognize them as maybe not good, but as wine. And I think you talked about Monkey Jacket. Like that's a great example for me. That's a wine that if you want to be dorky about it, we could talk about that for 3 hours in terms of how we use concrete and different blocks in Mendocino that go into that and the vine age and everything else. And we can do all that. And it can be dorky as you want. At the same time, that's a wine that costs $25 on our website. And if you want to just crush a case at a barbecue, that's no skin off my back. In fact, I think that's how it should be.
Yeah, totally.
So that ends up being the guiding principle for me. In terms of kind of things we have working on, I think one of the things that I look at, I don't know exactly how I would phrase this, but I would say that like you talked originally about, did I have any sort of draw to wine from like Terry Leighton or anything like that? And I think it's fair to say that I didn't per se. There was nothing specific about Terry that like drove me to get into wine.
Mm-hmm.
However, I would still say that experimentation, small R, like research into different techniques and things is still something we do. For us, the demo series, which we release once a year, is a series of wines that we do for crews that are playing around with different techniques. For example, reserve cask, which is our bottling of just the reserve wine that's had an extra amount of aging in bigger casks, 1,000, 2,000 liter casks. We've done very oxidative, no sulfur Blanc de Noirs from Alder Springs or Charlie Heinz under that program. So these are like ways to show people like, hey, if you take this technique, if you start copying Alexander Charton in some of how he makes like Urtebez, you can see that in Alder Springs. And
Right.
we're not copying the wine, but we're applying those techniques and seeing how does that release or how does that reveal sight and things like that. So that's something that we just started it last year, although we've been doing it for 5 years behind the scenes. So that's something that we've been playing around with.
I just want to again tell you how happy I am that I had a chance to meet you today. That it wasn't until about a couple of months ago that I learned about you, but thanks to Dustin Wilson and just learning about your wines, learning about you being a native of California, having a love and a passion for your area. I know when you were getting into wine, I'm not sure if your parents were necessarily super crazy about the idea. And here you are, dude, today, like you're a massive figure in the wine industry. You're somebody that I instantly put at the top. You're because of what you have done to stretch the envelope. You actually cast this net. Like you cast the net wide and you said, I'm going to do everything I can, whether it was from the time you were studying to get better while you were working, or the things that you've done to make Ultramarine and Cruse has been just a breath of fresh air. It's very refreshing to see that, to be very specific and focused on terroir. And dude, I could have gone another couple of hours. We could have talked about so much, but I hope that today we've had an opportunity to get a little bit of a taste of what Michael Cruse is all about. And I am so honored to have you here, brother, on the podcast.
Awesome, man. I really appreciate your time and the kind words.